December 16th, 1944. A command post somewhere in the Ardennes. The air thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of wet wool. Outside, snow is falling on a forest that has swallowed entire divisions whole. Inside, a German staff officer unfolds a captured map across a wooden table. It is not one of his own. It is American, printed on tough, coated paper, and it shows his homeland back to him in a way he has never seen it before. A logging track, barely wide enough for a handcart, is marked with the same care as a motorway. A footbridge over a stream, the sort a local farmer might cross without thinking, is annotated with its likely load-bearing capacity. He runs a finger along a ridgeline he grew up walking, and finds contour detail his own general staff never bothered to survey. For a moment, he says nothing. Then he mutters that it is not fair, and moves on, because there is a war to fight, and the war will not wait for him to feel the strangeness of being outmapped in his own country. That single moment, buried in the chaos of the last great German offensive in the West, captures something larger than one officer's frustration. It captures a quiet revolution that had been building for years, one fought not with rifles or tanks but with cameras, drafting tables and printing presses, and one that mattered every bit as much as the weapons pointed across the front line. This is the story of how the Western Allies learned to know enemy ground better than the enemy did, and why that knowledge became one of the decisive, unglamorous weapons of the Second World War. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand what military mapping looked like in 1939. Most European nations, including Germany, still relied heavily on peacetime cadastral surveys, land registry maps drawn up decades earlier for taxation and civil administration, never intended for artillery ranging or armored maneuver. Germany's own general staff maps of its border regions were, in places, over 30 years old, based on imperial-era surveys that predated the motor car in any serious numbers. Roads had been widened, forests replanted, villages expanded, and none of it reliably updated. A tank commander relying on such a map could find a bridge that no longer existed, or miss one that had been built since the map's last revision. The problem deepened once war began in earnest. Front lines moved constantly, sometimes by tens of kilometers in a single week, and paper maps simply could not be redrawn fast enough by traditional ground survey, which required teams of surveyors physically walking terrain with theodolites and chains, a process measured in months, not days. Britain, drawing on hard lessons from the previous war, understood that whoever solved this problem first would gain an advantage that no single battle could match. The challenge was not simply making maps, it was making accurate maps of hostile or inaccessible territory, updated constantly at a scale and speed no one had previously attempted, using only what could be seen from thousands of meters above the ground. The answer came from a partnership between photography and mathematics, run out of unglamorous buildings that would win no medals. At the Hayes headquarters of the Ordnance Survey, and later at the vast Army Map Service complex established in Washington, technicians developed the discipline of photogrammetry into something approaching an industrial process. Reconnaissance aircraft, principally modified Spitfires and Mosquitoes stripped of guns and armor for extra speed and range, flew overlapping passes across enemy territory at carefully calculated altitudes, their cameras clicking every few seconds so that each frame overlapped the last by roughly 60%. That overlap was the trick. Viewed through a stereoscope, two overlapping photographs taken from slightly different positions create the illusion of 3 dimensions, rather like the effect of 2 eyes giving a person depth perception. Skilled interpreters, many of them women recruited specifically for their patience and precision, could measure the height of a church spire or the gradient of a riverbank to within a meter or two, purely from a pair of flat photographs. This raw data then passed to drafting halls where hundreds of cartographers, working in shifts around the clock, converted photographic measurement into printed contour maps at a scale of 1 to 25,000, detailed enough to show individual farm buildings and cart tracks. production numbers remained difficult to pin down precisely, since much of the paperwork was destroyed or never centrally logged, but surviving Army Map Service records suggest tens of millions of individual map sheets were printed and distributed to Allied forces in Europe by the war's end, an output roughly comparable in sheer paper tonnage to a mid-sized national newspaper running continuously for years. By late 1944, this machinery was feeding frontline American and British units maps of German territory more current and more detailed than the maps German commanders held of their own soil, because the Wehrmacht's own survey and printing capacity had been stretched thin, then bombed, then starved of paper and skilled staff as the war turned against it. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing but a tap. Evidence from the Ardennes fighting and later the crossing into Germany itself shows American engineers repeatedly locating fords and secondary bridges that German defenders had not accounted for in their own planning, using exactly this photo-derived mapping. Accounts from combat engineers describe using these sheets to route armor around demolished bridges within hours, work that would previously have taken days of reconnaissance under fire. Precise casualty figures attributable to this mapping advantage alone cannot be isolated from the broader intelligence picture, and historians are careful to note that superior maps won no battle by themselves. But officers on the ground repeatedly described the psychological jolt of watching an enemy who seemed to understand the battlefield better than its own inhabitants. Germany was not without its own aerial survey capability. The Luftwaffe had produced excellent photographic reconnaissance early in the war, feeding the invasions of Poland and France, but by 1944, fuel shortages and Allied air superiority had grounded most of that capacity, and what photographs were taken increasingly could not be safely developed, printed, or distributed to units under constant Allied bombing of rail and road networks. The Americans, by contrast, had built redundancy into the entire chain, with printing plants in England, France, and eventually Germany itself, ensuring supply never depended on a single vulnerable location. This was the true difference. It was not that the underlying technology was radically more advanced on the Allied side. It was that the Allies built the industrial pipeline to apply it at scale, continuously, under wartime pressure, while German capacity fractured under the weight of the war it had started. The legacy of this quiet mapping effort outlasted the guns by decades. Many of the photogrammetric techniques refined at Hayes and in Washington became the backbone of post-war civilian cartography, feeding directly into the national mapping agencies of Britain, the United States, and a reconstructed West Germany, and eventually into the satellite survey methods that underpin modern digital mapping. The aerial survey archives themselves, millions of negatives stored in humidity-controlled vaults, remain in national collections today, occasionally still consulted by historians tracing old boundaries, by engineers checking the age and condition of infrastructure, or by archaeologists spotting buried features invisible from the ground. Original wartime map sheets can still be viewed at the National Archives in Kew and at the United States National Archives in College Park, fragile paper witnesses to a war fought as much with cameras as with cannon, their contour lines and pencil annotations a record of an industrial effort most people who benefited from it never knew existed. So return for a moment to that command post in the Ardennes, to a man staring at a map of his own country made by strangers. He was not looking at treachery or magic. He was looking at the simple, overwhelming result of an industrial effort his own side could no longer match. Patience turned into photographs. Photographs turned into geometry. Geometry turned into paper, and paper turned into an advantage that followed his army all the way home. It was not fair, in the sense that a fight between an exhausted survey office and a continent-spanning printing operation was never going to be fair. But it was real, and it was decisive, and it is one of the quietest, least celebrated victories of the entire war. The tanks got the headlines, the maps got the results,